For 10 days, 17-year-old Bernard Oliver seemed to have vanished after leaving his home in North London. Then, more than 80 miles away, 2 suitcases in the Suffolk countryside revealed the horrifying truth. This is the haunting true story of Bernard Oliver. On Friday, the 6th of January 1967, 17-year-old Bernard Michael Oliver left his home in Muswell Hill, North London. What happened after that remains one of the most disturbing mysteries connected to Britain in the 1960s. Bernard did not simply vanish and leave behind an unanswered question. 10 days later, more than 80 miles from London, human remains were discovered inside 2 suitcases in the Suffolk countryside. The victim was Bernard. Whoever had killed him had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal both the crime and the identity of the person they had murdered. Nearly 6 decades later, no one has ever been convicted. Bernard was still a teenager when he disappeared. His life had barely begun, which made what followed all the more difficult for his family to comprehend. On that Friday in January, there was nothing to suggest that his name would soon become attached to a murder investigation extending far beyond London. At some point after leaving home, Bernard crossed paths with the person, or possibly the people, responsible for his death. Where that happened has never been established with certainty. Neither has the exact sequence of events that took him from Muswell Hill to wherever he was killed. For 10 days, Bernard's whereabouts remained unknown. Then, on Monday, the 16th of January, the investigation changed completely. In Suffolk, near the village of Tattingstone, 2 suitcases were found containing dismembered human remains. The discovery immediately presented investigators with several problems. They did not initially have a name for the victim. The body had been deliberately cut apart, placed inside luggage, and transported to a rural location. Before detectives could investigate who had committed the murder, they first needed to establish whose remains had been abandoned there. The location itself raised a question that would never receive a satisfactory answer. Tattingstone was far from Bernard's home in North London. Whoever transported the suitcases had covered a considerable distance while carrying evidence of a murder. That required a method of transport and an opportunity to move through the area without attracting enough attention to identify the person later. The killer had chosen somewhere away from Bernard's normal surroundings, creating a geographical break between the victim's life and the place where his remains were recovered. The condition of the body also told investigators that concealment was part of the crime. Dismemberment was not necessary simply to kill Bernard. It happened afterwards and changed what the offender needed to do next. The remains had to be handled, packed, and moved. 2 suitcases then became physical objects connecting the unknown killer to the disposal site. Each stage created opportunities for someone to see something, remember a vehicle, or recognize the luggage. Yet none of those opportunities produced the evidence required to identify Bernard's murderer beyond reasonable doubt. Investigators began the difficult process of identifying the victim. At a time long before modern DNA databases and digital missing person systems, establishing the name of an unidentified body could demand painstaking police work. Details associated with the remains and clothing were examined, and information was circulated as officers attempted to connect the discovery in Suffolk with reports of people missing elsewhere. A laundry mark became part of the effort to trace the victim's identity, giving investigators another potential route back to the person whose body had been found. The breakthrough eventually connected the remains to Bernard Oliver. The unidentified victim in Suffolk was the 17-year-old who had disappeared from Muswell Hill 10 days earlier. For Bernard's family, the uncertainty surrounding his disappearance had now been replaced by something far worse. For detectives, identification transformed the case. They could begin reconstructing Bernard's final days, examining his movements and looking for anyone who might have seen him after he left home on the 6th of January. That reconstruction carried a fundamental difficulty. The most valuable period in the investigation had already passed. By the time Bernard was identified, the killer had enjoyed days in which to dispose of objects, clean locations, alter routines, or simply disappear back into ordinary life. Witness memories could already have begun to fade. A vehicle that might have seemed unremarkable on the night of the crime would be much harder to remember later. Bernard's final movements therefore became one of the central mysteries surrounding the case. Police inquiries expanded substantially. Officers took thousands of statements as they attempted to establish who had encountered Bernard and how he might have traveled from London into the circumstances that led to his death. Every credible account potentially mattered because investigators were trying to bridge a gap in which almost everything remained uncertain. Bernard's last confirmed movements, the location where he was attacked, the place where he died, and the route used to carry his remains into Suffolk. The distance between Muswell Hill and Tattingstone made transport particularly significant. The suitcases did not arrive in the Suffolk countryside by themselves. Someone brought them there. That person needed to move 2 pieces of luggage containing human remains over a long distance and then leave them behind. The practical demands of that act narrowed some possibilities while creating others. Access to a vehicle would have made the journey considerably easier, but identifying a particular vehicle decades before automatic number plate cameras or widespread surveillance presented detectives with an enormous challenge. The disposal site may also reveal something of the offender, although any conclusion has to remain a theory rather than a fact. A person choosing a location far from Bernard's home may have wanted distance between the murder and the victim's disappearance. Another possibility is that the offender already knew the area and selected somewhere that felt familiar. There is no conclusive evidence proving either explanation. What can be said is that Tattingstone became the final known destination in a journey whose starting point investigators never conclusively established. That missing location matters because a dismemberment of this kind would have required privacy. Whoever carried it out needed enough time to work without interruption and then remove the remains. If detectives had been able to establish that location, it could have transformed the investigation. Instead, they were trying to work backwards from the suitcases, from Bernard's identity, and from whatever traces survived after the crime. The room, building, or other place where Bernard was killed and dismembered has never been conclusively identified. The investigation also unfolded in a very different forensic era. In 1967, detectives did not have access to the techniques now routinely associated with major crime inquiries. DNA profiling was still decades away. There were no searchable national databases capable of producing rapid genetic matches, no mobile phone location records, and no network of digital cameras tracing a person's movements across cities and roads. Investigators depended heavily on physical evidence, witness testimony, conventional forensic examination, and the painstaking comparison of information gathered by officers. That does not mean the case was ignored. The scale of the inquiry shows the opposite. Police devoted considerable effort to tracing Bernard's movements and finding the person responsible. Statements accumulated, leads were examined, and possible connections were explored. But a large investigation does not automatically produce a prosecutable suspect. Information can be contradictory, witnesses can be mistaken, a person can appear suspicious without there being evidence that proves involvement in a murder. In a case carrying so many unknowns from its earliest stages, those problems were magnified. Bernard's age also shaped public interest in the murder. He was 17, and the brutality involved was difficult to reconcile with how young he was. Newspapers could describe the suitcases, the discovery, and the search for a killer, but behind those details was a teenager whose final hours remained almost completely hidden. The absence of a proven narrative would later create fertile ground for theories, some of which became more dramatic as the years passed. That creates a particular problem when looking back at the case today. Unsolved murders often accumulate stories that gradually become repeated as though they were established evidence. Names can become associated with a crime because of reputation, geography, or later speculation rather than proof. Bernard's murder has attracted theories over the decades, but theory cannot replace evidence. No court has established who killed him, and no version of his final hours has been proven sufficiently to close the case. The lack of a conviction also leaves open the possibility that people encountered during the original inquiry knew more than they revealed. That possibility applies to almost any unresolved homicide, so it cannot identify a particular individual. What makes Bernard's case especially frustrating is the amount of activity the offender had to undertake after the killing. The body was dismembered, suitcases were used, the remains were transported from one part of England to another. Every one of those actions increased exposure, yet investigators still could not build the chain of evidence necessary to bring the killer before a court. Time then became the enemy of the investigation. Months turned into years, and years into decades. Witnesses aged, memories became less reliable. People who might once have been able to answer questions died. Physical evidence that survived acquired increasing significance because modern forensic science offered possibilities unavailable to the officers working in 1967. Advances in DNA analysis have allowed investigators around the world to revisit evidence from cases once thought impossible to solve, provided useful biological material still exists. Suffolk police have revisited Bernard's murder, and the surviving forensic material has remained relevant to efforts to examine the case with techniques developed long after the original investigation. That does not guarantee a result. Old evidence can be degraded, contaminated, or too limited to produce a usable profile. Even when a profile can be obtained, it must lead to someone whose connection to the crime can be established. Forensic science can reopen doors, but it cannot reconstruct evidence that no longer exists. What remains certain is painfully limited. Bernard Michael Oliver was 17 years old. He disappeared from Muswell Hill on Friday, the 6th of January 1967. 10 days later, on Monday, the 16th of January, human remains were discovered inside 2 suitcases near Tattingstone in Suffolk. Those remains were identified as Bernard's. His body had been dismembered. A major police investigation followed, but nobody was convicted of his murder. Everything between Bernard leaving London and the discovery in Suffolk contains the mystery. Somewhere within those 10 days, he met the person responsible for his death. Somewhere he was killed. Somewhere his body was dismembered and placed into the suitcases. Someone then transported those suitcases to Suffolk and abandoned them near Tattingstone. The killer completed that sequence without leaving investigators enough evidence to prove who had done it. Almost 60 years later, the unanswered question has not changed. Bernard's murder survives not because the crime lacked investigation, but because the missing pieces have never been connected strongly enough to identify his killer in a court of law. The suitcases gave police a victim. Bernard's identity gave them a life to investigate. Thousands of statements gave them information. Decades of forensic progress gave the case new opportunities. What none of those things has yet provided is the one answer Bernard's family was denied from the beginning. Who killed 17-year-old Bernard Oliver?